Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is for Friday, April 7th, no, 11th. Friday, April 11th, 2025. Um, Easter is not far away. If I recall correctly, it's a week from this coming Sunday. So 11, 12, 13th, this coming Sunday, which would be Palm Sunday, would be the 13th. So then Sunday the 20th, as I recall, is Easter this year. And you're seeing a bunch of Easter stuff in terms of advertising and so forth. And there's a game I play called Car Mechanic Simulator, and they occasionally put seasonal things into the shop that you do your work in. And I noticed today that there were colored Easter eggs sitting at various locations inside that shop, including on top of the control box for the main car lift, the one that I normally use as I work on cars that I bring in. And what I did today was this: it gives you a number of options for getting cars that you can work on and fix up and sell. You can go to an auction and you can buy cars at auction. You can get barn maps and you can go to these barns and you can buy cars out of these barns and fix them up. And the other option is you can go to the junkyard. And whenever you go to the junkyard, it normally has 3 cars there, normally in terrible condition. And you buy them real cheap and then you fix them up and sell them. And you can usually make a profit at these things. This is all virtual, of course, but so that's what I was working on today. I went to the junkyard, bought 3 cars, brought one in, was working on it, and notices those decorated Easter eggs on various places in the shop. So, as far as things happening this week, it has been a much quieter week than in the weeks past. The terrible weather is pretty much gone away for now, so we haven't had any of that to deal with. Things have begun to dry out. I was able to actually drag out the lawnmower and shorten the weeds yesterday. So that's something now that's going to have to be done every 2 weeks for the rest of the summer. I think last year it was into late September, early October before I quit. And I've had years when it got so dry that from August on I didn't need to run the mower, but we probably won't have that dry a summer this year. So there'll be plenty of work to do. Keep me from dying of inactivity. And other than that, nothing particular of note. I did have a few thoughts about how people are and some of the disasters that befall people and why that happens. As you may know, because of previous discussions, I like to watch videos of real court cases. Um, uh, Sometimes I actually watch the stream put up by the judge in the particular case. There's a number of courts in Michigan that put their proceedings up on YouTube and live stream them, plus then the stream's available to view later. Or there's a lot of people that will find these things and edit them, maybe edit out dead space and put up comments and so forth, and I'll watch these things. One of the big matters that come before district courts, most of what's up there is district courts. Circuit courts are much less likely to do this. One of the issues that comes before district courts is landlord-tenant matters. And essentially, landlords are taking their tenants to court, seeking to get them to pay the rent, or if they've had it up to here with them not paying the rent or with other problems, seeking to terminate their tenancy. Now, there are laws that protect tenants in those cases. Those vary from state to state. But in general, if you're going to go to the court and seek to evict a tenant, you have to give them 30 days notice. Once it goes to court, then the court is required to adjourn the case for at least 7 days once the tenant and slash defendant has shown up in court. And that gives them time to do something about the problem so they don't end up getting evicted and don't have an eviction on their record. But then at some point, and not all judges like this, if the tenant doesn't have a legal reason not to have paid rent, then the judge either issues a judgment, pay the rent or be evicted, or if it's a termination of tenancy case, which at least in some states, if the landlord files a termination of tenancy case, they're not allowed to accept rent at that point. You can't make them pay rent while you're trying to get them evicted. Like I said, that's the law in some states. But ultimately, this is how people end up homeless. They live in a place, they lose their job, or something else happens, and oftentimes, of course, that's through some fault of the person. They lost their job because they weren't attending regularly. They lost their job because they were dishonest and trying to enrich themselves through the resources of the company they worked for. They lost their job because they had a bad attitude with their supervisors. There can be a lot of reasons why people lose their jobs, and while it's not always entirely their fault, generally there is some fault on the part of the person who loses their job. But then they lose their job. Of course, then there are times when people just get laid off because the economy's not doing well and the company believes it can't afford to keep employing all these people, so it lays them off. Well, then, however, you end up losing your job, you're not getting paid, and if you're not getting paid, most people live paycheck to paycheck. So if they're not getting paid, they don't have money to pay the rent. They don't have savings to tide them over a gap in their employment. And so then they end up getting called into court and evicted. And if they're evicted, they don't have any money. They don't have any way to find a different place. Some of them can go live with family. That creates a lot of problems very often. Or they just end up homeless, sleeping in the car, or just sleeping on the street. And now there are cities that are taking steps to criminalize homelessness. So these people can really end up behind the expectations of society, and to some extent through no fault of their own. Now, then there's the viewpoint. Well, society shouldn't put people in that situation. Well, that can get into politics, and we make a point in this group that politics aren't going to solve anything. We don't look for political solutions to human problems because politics is part of the problem. In this particular instance, it's our whole system of commerce that is also part of the problem. And commerce came about because we had to find a way to deal with living among broken humans who would be dishonest and would try to take things that weren't theirs, or that they didn't have a right to. But if you look at it from the Creator's point of view, every living human should have a right to the basic necessities of life. Now, with that would come an obligation to help others. That's certainly part of the plan, But once you have humanity fixed and everybody lives by love, then those problems all go away. You no longer need commerce. You no longer need these things. So essentially, we as human beings live in a very less than ideal situation. And evolution ultimately has very poorly prepared us for the world we live in, but also even more poorly prepared us for living as the Creator intended us to live, so that we become capable of eternal life. So, just a few thoughts that came across during the week. And I think it's a good time for us to go ahead and bow our heads, and we'll begin our Bible study formally right after our prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for your blessings. Thank you for the week that has passed, for giving us another week of life, and for giving us an opportunity to come together and to think about you, and to contemplate your character, and to seek to have our own characters reformed so that they match your design for life. We want that process to take place, and we would like our excursion in the written word now to provide support toward that effort. And we know that if that's to take place, we need the blessing of the Holy Spirit. That's not something that happens to a group of people. It's something that happens to each person individually. So we ask that each person who joins this study and who desires that blessing might receive your Spirit. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let me ask.
Ask what?
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, I want to ask you something. Back to what you were saying about how people are acting. I don't do well in interacting with people. I mean well, but people don't people mistake my well wishes for something weird. I don't know what it is.
Well, there is the possibility that both you and I.
Finish this, please.
Okay.
So I want to know how I should have handled this, in your opinion.
Well, I'm not sure my opinion's much better than yours.
It happened to me.
Okay.
Somebody came to me and asked me to justify another person's behavior when this person committed an act that is so grievous, not even the basest of heathens would have done it. Yet this person who did it is presenting himself to be almighty and righteous and a big Christian. And I was asked how his behavior represents the church and how a church can represent a God like that.
And how did you answer?
Well, the person who asked me already knew where I stood. And it was a case of, well, at least I took it to be a case of, well, it was my daughter-in-law who asked me that.
Okay.
And I took it to be her way of agreeing with me that there are people out there who will use religion as a way to make themselves look good and better than others, yet underneath their character is totally depraved.
Yeah.
And, I told her how I felt. She kind of agreed with me. But and with her, I got away with it because she already knows how I feel. But how would you say that to somebody who doesn't understand and believes that the church is, and the people who claim to be representing the church are representatives of God, and when they do things that are so egregious,
Yeah.
whatever the word is, how are you supposed to respond?
Well, I was going to say, I think both you and I have the problem that we're somewhere on the Asperger's syndrome spectrum, where they sometimes say on the spectrum, where we both have a little bit of dysfunction in how we understand and relate to others. And so other people find what we do off putting just because we kind of operate from a different set of rules, I suppose, from other people, and what we think is just fine, other people, that's awful, or that's weird, or something like that.
Yeah, and then you can go and copy what you see somebody else do, like Sabbath school.
Mm-hmm.
You get up front and welcome the visitors.
Yeah.
And I got up front and welcomed the visitor. I got told I embarrassed him so bad, he'd never set foot in that church again. All I said was, welcome, and I called him by name.
Yeah.
Which everybody does.
Well, there may have been some prejudgment bias in that assertion, that you're such a terrible person that for you to invite somebody to church is an affront and an insult.
I didn't invite him to church, I welcomed him.
Well, the welcome, that's what I meant. For you to welcome them to church was an insult because you're such a terrible person. And that reveals the bias of the person making that assumption more than it reveals the reality of who you are.
Yeah, okay. But yeah, you're right. But yeah, you're right about the masking.
Now, we finished the first chapter of First Kings last week, so we are ready to get into First Kings chapter 2. And we are close to, but not at yet, the death of David. But before I get into that, I wanted to, and I have left the Bible I wanted to read this out of over here. I wanted to read a passage out of the book of Deuteronomy. Now, when we were going through the Old Testament, we got to Deuteronomy, we kind of just skipped through it in a big hurry because it has so many arcane rules and things. It's very tough to get through. So we just kind of sped through it and moved on into the historical books. But there is a section out of this that I would like to read leading up to what we're going to read today. I'm going to be reading from the Amplified Bible out of Deuteronomy chapter 17. And Deuteronomy chapter 17 starts out talking about sacrifices, prohibiting sacrifice of defective or diseased animals. Talking about people who worship other gods and essentially issuing the death penalty for such people. And then talking about how if you have a case that's a legal case that's too difficult to decide, you're to go to the place that God would choose to the priests and to the person who is the appointed judge, and then you would need to obey whatever that judge decided. And of course, we know that once the period of the judges ended, and Samuel ended up anointing Saul to be king over Israel, that role of judgment passed from the judges like Samuel to the king like Saul and then David. And we've read recently how in seeking to usurp the throne, Absalom sort of offhandedly criticized his father's handling of the legal cases that were brought to him and tried to steal the hearts of the people of the nation. And so that's talked about here. And so then this passage gets into the issue of a king. So I'm beginning at verse 14. When you come to the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live there, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are about me. So this is forecasting what would eventually happen. You shall surely set as king over you him whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner who is not your brother over you. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to multiply horses, since the Lord said to you, you shall never return that way. And he shall not multiply wives to himself, that his mind and heart turn not away, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. And then it goes on, and it makes some other interesting pronouncements about the duties of whoever gets named king. And when he sits on his royal throne, he shall write him a copy of this law in a book out of what is before the Levitical priests. So essentially, it required that the king personally go to the priests and copy from what the priest had the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of the law. He was to write this for himself, and then that became his copy. And the process of actually writing it out personally would help fix that law in his mind. And he shall keep it with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn reverently to fear Yahweh his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his mind and heart may not be lifted up against his brethren, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long, he and his sons, in his kingdom in Israel. Now, just have that in mind. That is what the book of Deuteronomy, that's the requirements the book of Deuteronomy places on those who would be king of God's chosen people. Did it happen? Well, as we go through this, we'll look at that. So let's switch over here to our typical setup. And here we are at 1 Kings chapter 2, and we begin reading. As the time of King David's death approached, he gave this charge to his son Solomon. So these are among the last words of David. He calls Solomon in. He's on his deathbed. They've hired a young woman to lie in the bed with him to keep him warm, because he's so close to death that his body isn't generating enough heat to keep him warm. So that is their approach to keeping him warm enough and extending his life by a few more days. And so it's in this situation that he calls Solomon in, and he says to him, I am going where everyone on earth must someday go. Take courage and be a man. Observe the requirements of the Lord your God and follow all his ways. Keep the decrees, commands, regulations, and laws written in the law of Moses, so that you will be successful in all you do and wherever you go. Now, does this mean that Solomon did what was required there in Deuteronomy 17 and actually hand wrote a copy of the law for his personal use? We don't know. It doesn't say. But David did tell him that he needed to follow the law, even if he didn't do that specific bit of writing it out for himself. If you do this, then the Lord, or Yahweh, will keep the promise he made to me. He told me, if your descendants live as they should and follow me faithfully with all their heart and soul, one of them will always sit on the throne of Israel. Now, in the Hebrew mindset from which this is written, the law of God was all those written rules that Moses transcribed and wrote down. In reality, the law of God is the principle on which life is designed to operate, the principle of self-sacrificing love, which makes social life possible without all the nonsense that we have developed since we fell into sin. So, if in this sense then, if David's descendants had lived by the law of love, then he would have been able to keep them on the throne forever. Now, this gets fulfilled then in Jesus Christ, who came to this earth in human flesh and lived the law of love in human flesh so we could see how it was done. He also did it in human flesh to demonstrate that it was in fact possible to live God's law of love in a human body. Or as one person has put, there was no manufacturer's defect in human flesh. And we've read that passage in Romans chapter 8, where God sent his Son in human flesh to condemn sin in the flesh. In other words, to demonstrate that it wasn't the flesh, our bodies, that make us prone to sin. It's something else, namely evolution, that makes us prone to sin. So it is possible through God's intervention for us to overcome our evolution and to be reformed in God's image. So, now that Jesus came in the line of David, and Jesus forever lives God's law of love, then in that sense, someone sits forever, for all eternity, on the, quotes, throne of Israel, out of David's line. Because he will never fail to keep God's law. And there is something else. You know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me when he murdered my 2 army commanders, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He pretended that it was an act of war, but it was done in a time of peace, staining his belt and sandals with innocent blood. Do with him what you think best, but don't let him grow old and go to his grave in peace. So essentially at this point, David is ordering his son to commit, or at least to order, murder against Joab in retaliation for the murders that Joab committed. And we know that Joab committed quite a number of them. Now, it's interesting that he doesn't name the death of Absalom, which was also Joab's doing, in this list of things, but he does name the two commanders, Ner, who had been Saul's army commander, and Amasa, whom David had intended to name as commander in place of Joab. And when Joab heard about that, he got rid of him in a hurry so he could keep his position. So now David is saying, now we crossed 3 footnotes there. Let's run down and look at those real quick, A, B, and C. A, he murdered them during a time of peace as revenge for the deaths they had caused in time of war. That's one way to render that part. Then in section B, that's as in some Greek and Old Latin manuscripts. The Hebrew reads with the blood of war. And then the Hebrew, and this will be the case in 2 places, don't let his white head go down to Sheol in peace. Sheol being the place of the dead or the grave. And I think you'll find that the King James actually reads it, don't let his head go down to the grave in peace. So anyway, and then there'll be something very similar to that coming up in verse 9. So then he gives further instructions. Be kind to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead. Make them permanent guests at your table, for they took care of me when I fled from your brother Absalom. We remember that, and I told you at the time that this Barzillai or his descendants would come up again in the text, and here it is. And remember Shimei, son of Gera, the man from Bahurim in Benjamin. He cursed me with a terrible curse as I was fleeing to Mahanaim. So both of these people involved here in David's instructions got their connection to David during Absalom's rebellion. And you may remember, Shimei is the one who came out and cursed David and said, you're getting what you deserve for shedding all this blood in the household of Saul. Well, yeah, there's an extent to which it is true that David did that. But anyway, that's what Shimei was saying. And he was throwing rocks and earth up into the air and cursing David for quite a period of time. He kind of followed along beside them as they were traveling. And when David came back, you may recall that Joab's brother wanted to kill him. And David says, no. So it says, when he came down to meet me at the Jordan River, I swore by the Lord that I would not kill him. But that oath does not make him innocent. You are a wise man, and you will know how to arrange a bloody death for him, or how to bring his head down to the grave in blood, to Sheol. And we already noted that in the footnote D there that we read ahead. Then David died and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. David had reigned over Israel for 40 years, 7 of them in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. Solomon became king and sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. Now that's kind of reading ahead a little bit when it says that, as we will see before we finish here. Yes, his kingdom was ultimately firmly established, but it wouldn't happen at this exact point. It would take a little bit of time, and we're going to read about the events that made that happen. And then we're going to say, wow, is that what it took? No wonder God didn't want them to have a king. One day, Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, came to see Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. Have you come with peaceful intentions? She asked him. Yes, he said, I come in peace. In fact, I have a favor to ask of you. Now, we could try to read into Adonijah's motives here, and in fact we will in a bit. Is he lying to Bathsheba with what he says here? Because he says he comes in peace, and he's just asking for a favor. But in the culture of the time, the favor that he's asking for was interpreted very differently. What is it? She asked. He replied, as you know, the kingdom was rightfully mine. Well, that's not entirely a lie. He's the firstborn son, the oldest eligible heir to the kingdom at this point in time. The oldest, Amnon, was killed by Absalom. The second oldest inherited, we believe, the estate of Nabal of Carmel. So he went to Carmel and took care of his dad's estate. And that was his inheritance. So he didn't have a share with his actual biological father David, but with his, I don't know if you'd call it stepfather, but his mother's first husband. He inherited that and became his son in a sense, in a legal sense. So then the third son, Absalom, was killed by Joab when he rebelled against his father. So now Adonijah is the oldest heir to the throne. And so he believes it's his right. The kingdom was rightfully mine. All Israel wanted me to be the next king. Well, that may not be entirely true, but there were people who were in favor of Adonijah as the next king. But the tables were turned, and the kingdom went to my brother, your son, instead. For that is the way the Lord wanted it. Well, that's his take on it, and there is evidence to suggest that that's what the Lord wanted. The author of this narrative has told us earlier that Adonijah never learned self-control because his father never taught it to him. His father essentially let him have his way. So he was kind of a spoiled brat. And in that sense, then, he probably would not have been a very good king. And we have suggested that Solomon was not subject to that because by the time Solomon was born, David was no longer as involved in the military matters and in fighting Israel's enemies and had more time to devote to things like raising his sons. So that Solomon may have received attention from his father that Adonijah did not. And for that reason, Solomon may well have been better suited to the throne. And so then in that sense, that's the way the Lord wanted it. So now I have just one favor to ask of you. Please don't turn me down. What is it? She asked. He replied, speak to King Solomon on my behalf, for I know he will do anything you request. Ask him to let me marry Abishag, the girl from Shunem. Now, most of you should be aware of what he's talking about here. This is the young woman that was brought in to lie in David's bed and keep his body warm by cuddling up to him, even though the king was too old to do anything other than just receive the warmth. All right, Bathsheba replied, I will speak to the king for you. So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak on Adonijah's behalf. The king rose from his throne to meet her, and he bowed down before her. He's showing respect to his mother. When he sat down on his throne again, the king ordered that a throne be brought for his mother, and she sat at his right hand. Now, why is it telling us this? Well, here's what I think. This is the origin of the position of Queen Mother in the nation of Israel. In order to honor his mother, King Solomon established what was a cultural tradition in other nations, probably, and made her Queen Mother, gave her a position of authority by setting a throne up beside him so that she sat at his right hand. And in the context of everything that has happened, how Bathsheba ended up being David's wife and ultimately bearing David the son that would become heir to the throne, it makes sense that the son who became king would honor her in some way. And at this point, it probably sounds like a very good thing that Solomon shows this honor to his mother, and it probably made a lot of sense to the people of the kingdom and was acceptable. But as we will see later in the story, it brings a lot of trouble on the nation.
I just had an epiphany about that story.
What about it?
Well, it bothered me that the outcome. But I got to where I understood why Solomon acted in the way that he did. But it struck me that Bathsheba, no fool. This was an act of manipulation to ensure that her son kept the throne. She gave him the tool he needed to get rid of his enemy.
Okay.
Knowing what the culture was, why would she go to him and request that Abishai be given in marriage to
Adonijah.
She knew. She wasn't,
I think you're right.
and she knew what Solomon would be justified in their culture to do.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And it was keeping her hands clean.
All right.
She was female, but Solomon could.
All right.
She showed herself to be a master manipulator.
Okay. Well, you might be right about that. Let's read this and see what happens. I have one small request to make of you, she said. I hope you won't turn me down. Well, Solomon's like, how can I turn down my mother? What is it, my mother? He asked. You know I won't refuse you. Except he will. But in a sense, if what you're saying is true, then he's ultimately going to give her what she really wants, even though it's not what she verbally asked for.
Just because the woman says one thing doesn't mean she actually means it.
Well, that's not necessarily true just to women. Men do the same thing, don't they?
The human nature?
Yeah.
I mean, please, whatever you do, don't throw me into the briar patch.
There's a reason she brought that up. Yeah. If you're familiar with that. I happened to in restoring my desktop computer in the other room, I had to drag out some hard drives looking for some stuff that I didn't actually find until today, and only just a few minutes ago got it put on that computer in there. But as I was looking for it, I came across a movie, and the movie was Song of the South. Song of the South is a movie that Disney has pretty much tried to pretend they didn't make, and it's hard to find. But it is Uncle Remus telling stories of Brer Rabbit. And that's probably the most famous of the stories of Brer Rabbit, is that, please, whatever you do, don't throw me into the briar patch. Anyway, so Solomon says, what is it? You know, I won't refuse you. And then she says, then let your brother Adonijah marry Abishag, the girl from Shunem, she replied. How can you possibly ask me to give Abishag to Adonijah? King Solomon demanded. You might as well ask me to give him the kingdom. You know that he is my older brother, and that he has Abiathar the priest and Joab, son of Zeruiah, on his side.
And then she turns around and looks at Absalom or whoever it was with a really smug look. See there? I did what you asked for. Wanted.
Yeah, be careful what you ask for. You might get it.
Yeah.
Except he wasn't going to get what he asked for. He was going to get what in that culture he deserved. Because in that culture, to have the king's wife was to be eligible to be king. And so by asking for Abishag, he was, in an offhanded way, asking for Bathsheba to betray her own son and let him have an argument that he should be king, not Solomon. And as my wife is suggesting, she goes ahead and makes the request formally to her son, understanding how her son will react, and giving him, like she says, the tools to go ahead and deal permanently with Adonijah.
Okay, wrong name.
Then King Solomon made a vow before Yahweh. May God strike me and even kill me if Adonijah has not sealed his fate with this request. The Lord has confirmed me and placed me on the throne of my father David. He has established my dynasty as he promised. So as surely as the Lord lives, Adonijah will die this very day. So King Solomon ordered Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, to execute him, and Adonijah was put to death. Now, just for the fun of it here, let me go back to look at the list of the sons of David. Because now we've seen the first 4 sons born to David at Hebron removed from the narrative. Amnon, at the hands of his brother Absalom. Chileab, I think his name was, because he inherited his pre-stepfather estate. And Absalom, because of his rebellion against David. And I'm looking up the passage because I want to see, there were 6 named. I want to see what the others were. And I've skipped right over it here. I'm sorry, it's taking me a while to find this. It's in 2 Samuel, but I'm not sure exactly where. Yeah, 2 Samuel chapter 3, starting at verse 2. Sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and his second Chileab. And in this, I'm reading the New American Standard Bible. They spell it with a CH instead of with a K. By Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And the third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And the fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. And the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, by David's wife Eglah. These were born to David at Hebron. So there are two more sons named here that never enter the narrative, other than at this point where they're named as Numbers 5 and 6. Solomon was considerably farther down the list because he was born in Jerusalem. How many years later, we're not sure, but he was about 30, we understand, like his father, when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years like his father. So in many ways, his reign mirrored that of his father. So since David reigned for 40 years, he was born 10 years into David's reign, which had been 3 years into his reign in Jerusalem, which would have been, he was at least 3 years younger than the sixth son named there, and probably more than that. So, scrolling on down. Then the king said to Abiathar the priest, "Go back to your home in Anathoth. You deserve to die, but I will not kill you now, because you carried the ark of the sovereign Lord for David my father, and you shared all his hardships. In other words, you were faithful to my dad. You deserve to die, probably because he had sided with Adonijah, but because of your faithfulness to my father, I won't kill you. But you need to go back to your home in Anathoth, and you need to stay there." And it says, so Solomon deposed Abiathar from his position as priest of the Lord, thereby fulfilling the prophecy the Lord had given at Shiloh concerning the descendants of Eli. And we read that way back at the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel. Now, Joab had not joined Absalom's earlier rebellion, but he had joined Adonijah's rebellion. So when Joab heard about Adonijah's death, he ran to the sacred tent of the Lord and grabbed onto the horns of the altar. Something cultural about that. That's what people did when they were in fear of their lives. And now he hears that Solomon has ordered the death of Adonijah. He sided with Adonijah. He knows he's guilty as all get out in the deaths of those two generals. And so he's afraid, and rightfully afraid, because he knows that in that culture he deserves death. When this was reported to King Solomon, he sent Benaiah son of Jehoiada to execute him. Benaiah went to the sacred tent of the Lord and said to Joab, "The king orders you to come out." But Joab answered, "No, I will die here." May have been a move to buy a little bit of time. So Benaiah returned to the king and told him what Joab had said. "Do as he said," the king replied. "Kill him there beside the altar and bury him. This will remove the guilt of Joab's senseless murders from me and from my father's family." Now this is not spiritual, actual guilt. This is social guilt. This is the public perception that Solomon's dealing with here. If Solomon lets Joab live and die of old age, then there will be a public perception that he has in some sense colluded with Joab in those murders. So it seems to become obligatory on Solomon to kill him simply to meet the social expectations that demonstrate that he is publicly condemning Joab's acts in these senseless and unjust murders. The Lord will repay him, Hebrew viewpoint again, for the murders of two men who were more righteous and better than he. Footnote E there, the Lord will repay him. Hebrews says, will return his blood on his own head. For the murders of two men who were more righteous and better than he. For my father knew nothing about the deaths of Abner son of Ner, the commander of the army of Israel, and of Amasa son of Jether, commander of the army of Judah. May their blood, may their guilt, their public perception of the guilt of this, be on Joab and his descendants forever, and may the Lord grant peace forever to David, his descendants, his dynasty, and his throne. So Benaiah son of Jehoiada returned to the sacred tent and killed Joab, and he was buried at his home in the wilderness. Then the king appointed Benaiah to command the army in place of Joab, and he installed Zadok the priest to take the place of Abiathar. Now, Zadok and Abiathar had served more or less in tandem together, contemporaneously, shall we say. There's another term. Concurrently. I was trying to think of the terms for sentences. You can serve sentences concurrently. That means you get 5 years of this and 5 years to that, but in 5 years you serve both of them. But if it's consecutively, then you have to serve 5 years, and then the next one kicks in, you have to serve another 5 years. The difference between concurrent and consecutive. So they kind of served as priests concurrently, in tandem, together. So Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, returned to the... well, we read that. Zadok becomes a priest in place of Abiathar. Then the king sent for Shimei and told him, build a house here in Jerusalem and live there. But don't step outside the city to go anywhere else. So this is kind of a probation type of thing. He's essentially saying, you deserve to die for how you treated my father, but I'm going to put that sentence in abeyance and put you on probation. Now, here are the terms of your probation. Build a house here in Jerusalem and live there, but don't step outside the city to go anywhere else. On the day you so much as cross the Kidron Valley, you will surely die, and your blood will be on your own head. It'll be your own fault if you leave the city, if you violate this condition of your probation. Shimei replied, your sentence is fair. I will do whatever my lord the king commands. So Shimei lived in Jerusalem for a long time. But 3 years later, 2 of Shimei's slaves ran away to King Achish, son of Maacah of Gath. Now, this is not the Maacah who was the mother of Absalom. This is a different Maacah. And he was the king of Gath. He is most likely the same king that David lived with for a time after he fled King Saul. He spent time with King Achish. The first time he went there, he feigned madness because he found out that King Achish's advisors were likely to advise Achish to kill him, so he feigned madness to get kicked out. But then he came back later and he actually got the city of Ziklag from Achish, and he wanted to go with Achish when they went out to fight the armies of Israel at the time that Saul died. He got sent home instead and ended up rescuing his own family, his wives and so forth, from the Amalekites who had attacked Ziklag when they found out that the Philistines were not watching their own backyard, but were in fact going after somebody else, leaving their own backyards unguarded. The Amalekites came in, took advantage of the situation, so on and so forth. Anyway, that's the story. And so this is probably the same King Achish. So now Shimei's two servants go and ally themselves with King Achish. And when Shimei learned where they were, he saddled his donkey and went to Gath to search for them. When he found them, he brought them back to Jerusalem. So now you kind of wonder, was he thinking at all? Was he thinking maybe he could do this and get back to Jerusalem and not be found out? Or more likely, had he kind of forgotten what the conditions of his probation were and just it didn't come to mind? And that's another thing that I was kind of running across this week. And that is that evolution has poorly prepared us for considering the future. We make decisions in our personal lives, we make decisions politically and in our national lives that are foolish in the long run because we are programmed by evolution to look for short-term gain. Evolution, some scholars have pointed out, ultimately prepares us for the past. It has no way to prepare us for the future because neither evolution nor ourselves know what the future is. Education can prepare us for the present. Evolution prepares us for the past. But what's going to prepare us for the future? Well, certainly evolution makes us particularly unsuited to make wise decisions with the future in mind. We have to actively overcome the pressures of evolution on us individually in order to focus on the future and not make foolish decisions. And this may be what's going on with Shimei here. It's been 3 years. He's kind of forgotten what the terms were for him not receiving the death sentence. He has to stay in Jerusalem. But the immediate need is the forced labor that he enjoys with these slaves, and he wants to get them back. That's the immediate need, and his brain kind of shuts off the future need of a prolonged life, and so he goes off after these slaves. And I'm getting a call. I'm going to have to decline the call here. Maybe I can do this that way, and it can go to voicemail, and he can find out later. He might try to call you now that he can't reach me, or did he try to call you already?
Oh, I don't know. Was it Ethan?
Yeah. Solomon heard that Shimei had left Jerusalem and had gone to Gath and returned. So the king sent for Shimei and demanded, "Didn't I make you swear by Yahweh and warn you not to go anywhere else or you would surely die? And you replied, 'The sentence is fair, I will do as you say.' Then why haven't you kept your oath to the Lord and obeyed my command?" The king also said to Shimei, "You certainly remember all the wicked things you did to my father David. May the Lord now bring that evil on your own head. but may I, King Solomon, receive the Lord's blessings. And may one of David's descendants always sit on his throne in the presence of the Lord. Then at the king's command, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, took Shimei outside and killed him. So the kingdom was now firmly in Solomon's grip. So essentially, we have one removal from office and 3 murders that served to put the kingdom firmly in Solomon's grip. And again, we see that's why God didn't want them to have a king, because this is what it took in that culture and in that part of the world for kings to establish their right to rule. It took murders and other such pronouncements to be carried out, and then everyone, okay, this guy's in charge. You don't rebel against him, or he'll send this Benaiah son of Jehoiada to separate your skull from the rest of your body.
In other words, rulership was the best fitted for rulership is the biggest murderer.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case. And by the way, remember, this Benaiah is the one who went into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. So he's good at killing. That's what kind of makes him significant.
Like politics.
Yeah. So the kingdom is now firmly in Solomon's grip, and he will have 37 more years to rule, and he will not always do really well. And I'm looking here. Hopefully we have time to finish this next chapter. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and married one of his daughters. He brought her to live in the city of David until he could finish building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around the city. At that time, the people of Israel sacrificed their offerings at local places of worship, for a temple honoring the name of the Lord had not yet been built. And I think you'll find that in other versions that reads high places. And in fact, let me look this up here in the New American Standard Bible. I'm at 1 Kings chapter 3, and just see how it reads there, because I think it'll say something very like that about high places. Yes, the people were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. So these high places, and this is kind of a natural human approach to divinity. If you go to Italy, one of the most famous buildings in Italy is that leaning tower in the city of Pisa. But throughout many of the cities of Italy, there are a lot of very tall towers. And in some cities, it would actually become a competition between the wealthy families of the city to who could build the tallest tower. And these towers had religious significance. If you go back into the Old Testament, the people were afraid about a flood, so they thought, well, we'll build a tower, run up into it. That Tower of Babel did have religious significance. So if God is elevated and up, and that's how humans tend to think of it, even though the earth goes, all the way around once every day. So wherever God is, it's up half the time and down half the time. We do tend to think of God as being up. And so if you can climb into a tower and get up higher, you can get closer to God. Now let's stop and think about it. In terms of the size of the earth, the tallest tower out there is essentially nothing. I think the tallest building these days is in Dubai. And what is that? A few thousand feet? Probably we haven't built anything that's a mile high yet. The earth is 24,000 miles through. Well, actually, it's probably more like 8,000 miles through, but still.
Wherever you happen to be, if you drill a hole all the way through, you're going to end up in China.
Yeah, right. But our tallest buildings even today, about a mile. I don't think we have any mile-high towers. Maybe they do. But the tallest buildings, even if there was a mile-high tower, compared to the distance through the earth of about 8,000 miles, it's almost nothing. Now, you put the earth into a tiny little spot in the solar system, how much gets covered in putting up a tower and climbing up into it? It's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. You're not making yourself significantly closer to God by climbing up into a tower. But that's the ridiculousness of the human mindset. And so the people of Israel, we want to get close to God. Let's go up on a hill. So if there's a hill, a high place, we're going to go up there and we're going to do our worship there because that gets us closer to God. That's the mindset that's going on. And these high places are going to be an issue throughout the rest of the history of Judah and Israel as we read through 1st and 2nd Kings. And there's going to be the removal of the high places. In fact, some time ago we read the story of Hezekiah and how the vassals and agents of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and dissed Hezekiah. And at one point he said, why is Hezekiah relying on Yahweh? Isn't Yahweh the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed? As if somehow Hezekiah were dishonoring God through removal of those high places. Of course, we made the point that God had intended for Israel to worship in a single place and not at high places like this as a guard against idolatry. So that in a sense, Hezekiah was honoring God, and these people just misunderstood what was going on.
A little piece of trivia, and I can't give you the text, but you might know it. God designed the clothing to be worn when going up on those high places. And in our culture, we would know that as your panties or your underwear.
What?
He designed and told them to wear specific clothing that would cover up their privates when they're going up on these high altars.
Well, actually, the very specific instructions were that they were not to build steps up to an altar or a place of worship. And so these high places, in a sense, violated that rule. And any approach. I mean, you look at the worship structures of Native Americans from pre-European times. And they have all these ziggurats and pyramids and so forth. All these are designed to get you up higher. And they do have religious significance. And God had told his people, no, you don't go up to my altar on steps. You don't need to be up higher to worship me.
Yeah, but there is a text in there where he designed undergarments.
Well, yes. Yes, he does. So that their nakedness would not be exposed.
Right.
Solomon loved the Lord and followed all the decrees of his father David, except that Solomon too offered sacrifices and burned incense at the local places of worship, or at the high places. The most important of these places of worship was at Gibeon. So the king went there and sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings. Now, here is where I think we're going to get a sense that God winks at people's ignorance. These high places were not God's original design for worship. And future kings would work to remove those high places as places of worship in obedience to the law given through Moses. However, in this case, possibly, God honors Solomon's worship at this high place, and if he does, then it would be winking, so to speak, at the ignorance that's displayed in going to this high place to do the worship. That night, the narrative tells us, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "What do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." Now, we could ask ourselves, is this something that really happened, or is this just the action of Solomon's mind bringing this vision to his mind as he imagines his future as king of Israel? But at any rate, the narrative says it this way: the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "What do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." Solomon replied, "You showed great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he was honest and true and faithful to you. And you have continued to show this great and faithful love to him today by giving him a son to sit on his throne. Now, O Lord my God, you have made me king instead of my father David. But I am like a little child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous they cannot be counted. Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom, so God replied, "Because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice, and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you ask for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, such as no one else has had or ever will have, and I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. And if you follow me and obey my decrees and my commands as your father David did, I will give you a long life." Now, there have been times in human history when 70 years is in fact a long life. I'm 70, so if I were to live as long as David did, I'm one foot in the grave and the other foot on a banana peel here.
Me too.
I don't expect to die right away. I'm not saying I won't, I'm just saying I don't expect to. I think I'm still pretty healthy and have a few years left. In our day, perhaps 70 isn't as much of a long life as it was before. My dad almost made it to 90. My grandfather, he made it to 76. But then he had a lot of health problems, so I don't know. I don't know how long I'm going to live. I'm not going to suggest that I do, but I'm pointing out that 70 years, which is roughly what Solomon had and what David had, might be considered long then, but not today.
When I'm gone, what are you going to do for a nag?
I'll have to nag myself, I guess.
How about you give me a microphone and I'll make a nag tape for you?
Now, some of the things that it said here, recall what we read in Deuteronomy 17. The king was not to get a lot of wives. He wasn't to get a lot of silver and gold. He wasn't to go to Egypt and get a lot and get horses. So now Solomon has gone to a high place, which isn't part of God's ideal. He has a dream in which God comes to him, and God says, well, I'm going to give you these things you didn't ask for, some of which I've already said I don't want the king to have. Is this really God speaking if he's promising Solomon things he said earlier in the book of Deuteronomy the king shouldn't have? Or is this just Solomon in his sleep processing, how our brains do, our dreams, our brains processing things and trying to figure out what we should remember and what we should forget, and processing things that have happened to us? What?
Having a dream and then believing it really happened.
Yeah. Well, and dealing with the stressors of life. Things stress us out in life, and our brains, as we sleep, try to deal with it through dreams. And so, what's the stressor that's stressing Solomon? Well, he understands the importance of his role as judge, as the ultimate judge in the nation, to deliver justice to the people when hard cases are brought to him. And he's feeling inadequate. And so in this encounter, be it imaginary or whatever, he expresses the true desire of his character, and that is, I want to be able to do a good job at this. And we honor Solomon for that desire. And then the narrative goes on to say, then Solomon woke up and realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, where he sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings. Then he invited all his officials to a great banquet. So the fact that he now goes back to Jerusalem and offers these sacrifices where he was supposed to suggests maybe there was a kind of a wake-up call issued here, and he realizes, hey, I wasn't doing it quite right. I want to do better. Then there is this story that illustrates the wisdom that Solomon had for judgment. This is a familiar story. And when it gets told, particularly to children, there's a key element of the story that we leave out, because we don't want to have to explain to children what a prostitute is. Verse 16, sometime later, 2 prostitutes came to the king to have an argument settled. And we say to ourselves, well, these are the people of God. What business is there in this nation of God-fearing people for there to be prostitutes? Well, there were. When Jesus came to this earth, some 1,000 years later. Some of the people that he dealt with were prostitutes right there in the land of Judah.
Hello.
What?
We were in elementary, and we were told it was two widows.
Yeah, some way to gloss over what's really happening here. Well, what we learned from this is A, there were prostitutes, and if there were prostitutes, then we know there had to be men who would patronize prostitutes. We sometimes call them Johns. So
Ask Peter about that.
that's more about the natural condition of humanity and its depravity than it is about whether Israel was good or bad. And a word about that. One of the elements of the doctrine of sovereign grace is the utter depravity of humanity. Unfortunately, in some interpretations of that, utter depravity becomes a legal thing. You are not worthy of God's grace, but he gives it to you anyway. Well, if God created you, then you are worthy of his grace. So utter depravity is not a legal or philosophical thing, it's an actual thing. The natural condition of humanity, as modified through evolution, is toward depravity. As we're reading here in these stories, all these things that Solomon had to do to establish himself as king, these are depraved. The fact that there are prostitutes in the land indicates that the people are depraved. That is the natural condition of humanity because of evolution. And until God is invited in to deal with our condition, then we're stuck in that depravity. And to me, that's the real meaning of utter depravity. As it says in Genesis, in the days of Noah, that humans were utterly corrupt, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were only evil all the time. And all I thought was evil all the time. There was no good left. So here we are. We start this story. There's two prostitutes. They lived together. They probably worked together. There was the house they lived in was some sort of a brothel. There may have been more than two, but there were two who came to the king. And they came to have an argument settled. And this is a case that probably came up before lower judges, before it came to Solomon. So here's the case. Please, my lord, one of them began, this woman and I live in the same house. I gave birth to a baby. We have no clue how that happened, right?
She was a widow.
Yeah. While she was with me in the house. 3 days later, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There were only two of us in the house. Well, all right, maybe it wasn't a larger brothel. Maybe it was just the two of them, but there were two of them there. But her baby died during the night when she rolled over on it. And in fact, that's why nowadays, generally women are advised not to sleep in the same bed with their babies because it's just human nature. You might roll around when you sleep. Also, they strongly advise that you don't put babies to sleep on their backs because that could lead to SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. put the baby to bed on its belly. I don't know what happened to me. I generally sleep either on my back or on my side. I don't think I could get away with sleeping on my belly. But anyway, so it makes me wonder if maybe my mother didn't do what nowadays they say you're supposed to. At any rate, it says she rolled over on it, so she may have suffocated it and the baby died. Then she got up in the night and took my son from beside me while I was asleep. She laid her dead child in my arms and took mine to sleep beside her. And in the morning, when I tried to nurse my son, he was dead. But when I looked more closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't my son at all. And then the other woman interrupted. It certainly was your son, and the living child is mine. Might I suggest that Solomon has had brought into his courtroom a couple of what we today would call Karens. And now they're going to argue with each other in the court. In our modern courts, generally judges look frown very much on the idea of people getting into an argument in their courtroom. And their instruction is, you talk to me, you don't talk to each other. And you don't interrupt each other. One person at a time. And the reason they give for that, which is in fact a valid reason, is that the court reporter can't take down what two people are saying if they're both talking at the same time. There's truth to that. But it's also, let's make sure that we aren't arguing and interrupting each other and being bigger jerks than we already are. So these two women are in here and they're arguing with each other, and both of them are claiming that the living child is their own and the dead child is the other woman's. And they're arguing back and forth before the king. And then the king said, let's get the facts straight. Both of you claim the living child is yours, and each says that the dead one belongs to the other. All right, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought to the king. And then he said, cut the living child in two and give half to one woman and half to the other. Then the woman who was the real mother of the living child and who loved him very much cried out, oh no, my lord, give her the child. Please do not kill him. But the other woman said, all right, he'll be neither yours nor mine. Divide him between us. And then the king said, do not kill the child, but give him to the woman who wants him to live, for she is his mother. And when all Israel heard the king's decision, the people were in awe of the king, for they saw the wisdom God had given him for rendering justice. And that's something that I think we all need to recognize. Anytime we show any level of intelligence, wisdom, smarts, any kind of mental prowess, ultimately that is something that God has given us. And it's not a case of God playing favorites. If we receive something in this life, we receive it because we were created by the Creator, and so the Creator created it in us, and it is a gift from Him that we are now obliged to the Creator to use to His glory, to the benefit of others, and ultimately to the benefit of ourselves. We have that obligation to the Creator to use what He has given to us effectively. Maybe that's a good term for it. And so if Solomon does this, if he shows intelligence, craftiness perhaps, wisdom, insight, if he has these things and he's able to use them, they were given to him by God. And what happened there earlier in the chapter at Gibeon may have nothing at all to do with it. He was given these things because he is a child of the Creator. And the Creator formed these things in him as the Creator formed him in his mother's womb. And what the king did here was to put the arguing women into a position of stress so that character could be revealed. And the character then revealed who really was the child's mother. Because the mother was willing to let the other woman have the child if that was the only way that the child could live. And then the king says, good, now I know what's going on here. I know who the mother is. You get to have the son, the living child. And the other woman, through her I don't know how you want to put it, her entitlement, her manipulative approach to life, revealed that she was manipulative and lying, and she didn't get what she was trying to get. The king found her out. And we have run over our normal time for our Bible study by a few minutes here. So I think this is a good time to wrap it up. We've done 3 chapters, chapters 2, 3, and, well, actually we've only done 2 chapters, 2 and 3, because we've already done chapter 1. So we've done 2 chapters out of the book of 1 Kings, and so we'll continue with chapter 4 next week. And then until next week, when we hope you'll join us again, we say goodbye and God bless.